I see some new faces, which is great. And I'm Sandy Clarice. I'm the Director of Public Programs for the Preservation Society. And as all of you know, or you're learning, that we've changed the approach to our tours this year, and we are very excited about it. We're getting a lot of great feedback from people who have gone through the training before that they're really enjoying the way we're doing this. What we're really looking to do is to tell a story. We have chosen these homes because they fit a particular theme, and that as our visitors move from house to house, we want them to understand and come away with an understanding of not only the house's architecture, its history, its inhabitants, but also how this house relates to the next one that they're going to see. So they have a full picture of whatever the theme, in this case, is the Antebellum villas is all about, and they walk away with a much stronger picture of what we want them to understand about Charleston. This approach came from about 5 years worth of research, where we went out to the people who had done tours in the past. We have a lot of repeat people, and they came back and said to us that they really were interested in learning more. They wanted to know more about how this house fit with Charleston, and much more about the architecture, and more about who lived here and what were they all about, as opposed to this particular piece of furniture or that particular piece of artwork that the owner may have collected. So we've changed the approach this year. It does, and it has put a lot more responsibility on our storytellers to learn and study and to be able to tell a story. We hope that we've given you enough information to do that with. If there's something in your packet that particularly piques your interest, give us a call, and if you want to know more, we'll find you more. We want you to know as much as you want to know and to be comfortable with it. These videos, all these sessions that will have been videotaped, and they will be online hopefully by next week, so that you can go back and review anything if you want to. But just feel free to call us if you have any questions. And basically, your role is to tell a story, given the information that we have that you have in front of you. And Evan Thompson is going to talk about Antebellum villas tonight. So,
thank you, Sandy, and Ashton, too, helping to bring this group together, and there are others who are not able to be here, so the video will be helpful. And if you know people who want to volunteer later, they can still participate. Mazyck-Wraggborough is an important neighborhood in our city. We've been touring Mazyck-Wraggborough for many, many years. And it's one of the last neighborhoods on the lower mid part of the peninsula to be restored. It's been a long process. There are a number of challenges that the neighborhood has faced, but they have overcome those, and it's a wonderful neighborhood, known not only for its villas, but for its single houses and its gardens. But we wanted to focus on the villas this year as a theme, to sort of talk about what makes this neighborhood different from some of the others. But before we do that, I wanted to show pictures of two houses in the neighborhood, just to illustrate the difference between a single house and a house that would be described as a villa. The Charleston single house, of course, is oriented in a perpendicular fashion to the street, entering onto the piazza that typically face either west or south. In this case, the house on Charlotte Street is a 3-story house with a 2-story piazza built with brick. It does have a very large yard, and so even where single houses were built in the early years in Mazyck-Wraggborough, the yards, the lots were fairly large. But the house on the right is oriented in a parallel to the street. Those double piazzas face to the south to capture breezes that come from the south. And because the lots were somewhat larger in the neighborhood, they were able to orient their houses facing to the south, providing space around the house on all sides. The houses were generally not abutting a single property line as a single house often does. The broad face of the house also afforded an opportunity to have a more grandly landscaped front yard. Of course, 36 Chapel Street is a great example of a very lush, large garden space that was able to be created. I'll talk a little bit about why this is the case, but in plan, a villa is typically a raised house with a central hall and a pair of rooms on either side of the hall, accessed from the central hall, and then at the rear of the hall, a staircase that would ascend to the second floor. So let's talk a little bit about the neighborhood. So, I'll have to get up. This is a map of Charleston in 1855, and Calhoun Street cuts across the peninsula. It was originally called Boundary Street, and until 1849, the city limits were Boundary Street was the city limits. So this is the older part of the city, and then the Charleston Neck was everything north of Boundary Street. And Mazyck-Wraggborough is in this area right here. And what happened was that as the older part of the city developed, it was a very densely developed part of the city, and it was very congested. And by the early part of the 19th century, it was over 100 years old, and there was a lot of new wealth in Charleston in the early 19th century, and people wanted to build new houses that were outside the confines of that congested lower part of the city. And by going across Boundary Street, or now Calhoun Street, lots were larger, it was not densely developed, there was a lot more open space. You could have views of marshes and creeks that have long since been filled in and obscured. But it was seen as also a more healthful place to be. It wasn't jammed up against your neighbor, the threats from fire were reduced. Yellow fever was a major issue in Charleston for many years in the 19th century, and this was considered to be a healthful part of the city. And so there are a lot of reasons why someone who had money to build a new house might choose to build in this part of the peninsula. In 1849, of course, the city limits were expanded to the north, and neighborhoods like Mazyck-Wraggborough, Radcliffeborough, Cannonborough, and Hampstead Village were incorporated into the city. Mazyck-Wraggborough is really two neighborhoods. It's Mazyck-Borough and it's Wraggborough. And there are distinct differences between them, although they're referred to as a single unit today. Mazyck-Borough was laid out in 1786 for a man named Alexander Mazyck. The boundaries of the neighborhood are Chapel Street, Elizabeth, Calhoun, and the Cooper River. Prior to its development, it was referred to as Mazyck's pasture, where a tree stood as a meeting place, the Sons of Liberty. This is a picture of Isaac Mazyck, Alexander's father. He looks rather successful and not too hungry. This is an early plat of Mazyck-Borough, and the boundaries again, Boundary Street on the south.
I'm sorry, it takes me forever to get anywhere.
Boundary Street on the south, the Cooper River on the east, Chapel Street on the north, and Elizabeth Street on the west. The central street traversing the neighborhood was Charlotte Street. Intersecting with that, Alexander Street. His name obviously comes from Alexander Mazyck. Washington Street, named for George Washington. Notice that there is no East Bay Street. East Bay Street does not come through this neighborhood until much, much later. Now, when this neighborhood was laid out, the lots look like a very generous neighborhood, but when you look at it more carefully, the areas that are shaded were creeks and marshes. So if you built a house on the north side of Charlotte Street facing south, you probably had a pretty good view of a marsh or a creek, and so it's a very attractive place to be. Notice also that Charlotte Street comes to an end at that creek, and what is now Washington Street was just a little piece and a figment of the imagination when you look at this drawing. So over time, eventually these marshes were filled, and we can now drive down the street without getting too wet. sometimes. Looking at it from a different angle, this is the bird's eye view of Charleston from 1872, and you can see East Bay Street does not yet exist. It was East Bay Street would later be cut in. This is a house that's on tour, 20 Charlotte Street. This is 16 Charlotte Street, which is the law office, which has been on tour in the past, but East Bay Street now cuts through roughly in this fashion, and this building is now most recently the Rice Market restaurant on the corner. But there's a lot more development on Washington Street, an integral part of the neighborhood, which has almost been entirely obscured and lost. But this is looking north, so it's a little bit of a disorientation for most maps. But you can see it's a relatively densely developed neighborhood along Calhoun Street by 1872. But when you look at earlier maps, this is the 1888 Sanborn map showing a fragment of Charlotte Street. Notice how spacious the lots were, how much room there is between each of the houses. The villas oriented to the south, a couple of large single houses with large lots around them. And we'll talk about the houses on the south side of Charlotte Street in just a second. But again, a wider view of the neighborhood. A couple of challenges that the neighborhood faced was eventually on the eastern side of the neighborhood along Washington Street would be gas works would be constructed and rail lines come in. Not appealing things for a residential neighborhood. And if you look at an aerial view of Mazyck-Wraggborough today, what was originally envisioned as a sort of far more comprehensive neighborhood through development and change with the library and the strip mall and the new development here, Mazyck-Wraggborough is now largely restricted to the northern and western parts of the original plan of the neighborhood. And you can see the old rail line and the fort to the east on what used to be tidal marshes, which would have been much more attractive than perhaps that parking lot is today. This is just another view of Charlotte Street showing two of the villas on the right, 16 and 20 Charlotte Street, overlooking the telephone tower, and some of the infill in later years where lots were subdivided, much smaller lots were created in the late 19th century where single houses were constructed, sort of changing the nature of the neighborhood. This is a photograph of 16 Charlotte Street from the 1930s. The hallmarks of a villa being this two-story house. This is a brick house with coins at the corners of the house, which is that detail where the bricks project out from the corner. It's a regular pattern. The house has a gable roof with a pediment that's sort of lurking above that parapet above the second level of the porch. For the piazza, you have the sweeping staircase coming down into the front. This is a feature of a house that you could not have on a single house, but that you could have on a villa. And some very nice ironwork in this neighborhood. 20 Charlotte Street is on tour. This is known as the Joseph Aiken House. It was built by, so this house at 16 was built by Robert Martin, and then he builds this one for his son-in-law and wife in 1848 for their marriage. Is anyone here a docent for 20 Charlotte Street? Well, 20 Charlotte Street is just a really wonderful example of Greek Revival architecture. The scale of the windows is very oversized, and when you step inside the house, the height of the ceilings and the sort of massiveness of the moldings it reflects a simplicity that's common in the Greek Revival period in the 1840s and 50s. Federal period style being much more delicate and refined in terms of its detail. Very tall, two-story portico, not much of a piazza, but a nice sort of front, very grand front entryway. And on the west facade, very difficult to see, but this sort of second-story loggia with the three arches sort of announcing where that is. A very finely detailed house, and when you step inside, so the height of the ceiling is really impressive, the heavy moldings in the house, very sort of correct Greek revival detail over those wide door openings where these two rooms would flow together as a large space for entertaining on the ground floor. So a very, very grand house that shows a significant investment in this neighborhood in the 1840s, and really up until the Civil War, this neighborhood was considered to be a very prestigious neighborhood to live in, and Charlotte Street was one of the premier streets in the city of Charleston at that time. This house a little bit down the street, 44 Charlotte Street, is one that I showed you earlier. I just think this one's interesting because this photograph was taken in 1937. It shows just some interesting innovation. When you look carefully at that piazza ceiling, what do you notice? It has a little bit of a gable too, kind of almost a gable reed to it on the inside. It just again shows a level of detail, and when you're showing your piazza off to the street as opposed to hiding it around the corner, you do some things to it to make it look a little bit more interesting. This house is not on tour, but people will see it as they walk down the street. Two other villas on Charlotte Street, 33 and 43 Charlotte Street. What is different about these two houses from the villas I've shown you already?
They're on the street.
They're on the street, there's no piazzas. That's right, there's no piazza that you can see, but these houses, these are the backs of those houses. They're facing to the south. And if you look at the Sanborn map, this is 33 and this is 43, and you can see on the south side they have piazzas. They have these very large lots that looked over that marsh that used to come in here. And these houses are both built, this one was built in the 1840s, this in the 1850s. They put the service buildings to the side so they wouldn't block their views and their vistas, and created piazzas on the south side. So these are basically villas just turned backwards. Both built in the, as I said, in the Greek Revival period, the same time frame as the Joseph Aiken house. Both feature the sort of sweeping stair, the projecting central pediment over the door, the coins along the corners. This house having been stuccoed, this one is left brick. But a lot of similarities between these houses in the 1840s. A sort of different architectural expression than you'll find in most other neighborhoods. And by way of contrast, this is of the same period, a very large single house that still took advantage of the wider lots to have a very lush garden space in the midst of these other villas. Now, what was less attractive were things like the gasworks that I referred to earlier. This is a photograph from 1937 showing the gasworks that were near Washington Street. And Washington Street doesn't offer much to us today. This is an example of a house that's been lost. 61 Washington Street is lost. And really all that's left on Washington Street are these vacant and abandoned brothels from years past.
Is that historically correct?
That is.
So that we may mention that?
You may mention that. You may mention these portside entertainment facilities.
Oh, that's a bigger word, yes, thank you. Portside
Welcome
entertainment
to
facilities.
There was a brothel on East Bay Street at Columbus Street that also doubled as a restaurant. And we have a photograph in our files from the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. Big sign on the front announcing that it was a place to come and eat. And it says, sailors welcome. If they come, they'll stay. That's Charleston, 1970. So, Mazyck-Wraggborough, let's move on to Wraggborough. Wraggborough was laid out in 1801. It's bounded roughly by Mary, King, Boundary, and Elizabeth Street, Mazyck-Wraggborough. Joseph Wragg bequeathed the property to his son John Wragg in 1758. John dies in 1796 without any children, and his siblings then subdivide the property in 1801. The streets are named for John and his siblings, Mary, Judith, John, Anne, Elizabeth, Henrietta, and Charlotte. They also dedicate 2 public spaces, Rag Mall and Rag Square. Rag Square is the plot of land in front of the Second Presbyterian Church, and Rag Mall is the land that stretches from Meeting Street over to the Aiken Rat House Museum. And again, like Mazyck-Wraggborough, it was outside the city limits until 1849. This is a portrait of Mrs. Joseph Wragg. Her daughter this is Elizabeth of Elizabeth Street. This is Elizabeth Wragg Manigault. And a parcel that she owned later becomes the site of her son Joseph Manigault's house. In this plan, you can see the land that was set aside. This is Rag Square. Second Presbyterian Church sits here, and this is Rag Mall, and the Aiken Rat House Museum is here. The Joseph Manigault house was built on these 2 lots. The federal building sits on this lot. Citadel Square Baptist Church is here, and there's a lovely gas station and convenience store here, which I'm sure was what they intended when they built it. And then Chapel Street Fountain Park sits roughly in here. This was a lot that was set aside for a church or a chapel, and it says it up in this cursive writing that we can't read. This was set aside for a church or a chapel. And the New Tabernacle Fourth Baptist Church sits on this corner in Mazyck-Wraggborough. If you look at, this is the 1872, a little bit of a wider view. And I think it's important to see in 1872 a couple of things. One, the railroad on the eastern side of the neighborhood, the railroad on the western side of the neighborhood, the location of the gas works. And this is Mazyck-Wraggborough. Wraggborough is much more densely developed, much more quickly than Mazyck-Wraggborough. This is a Sanborn fire insurance map that shows the western portion of Wraggborough from John Street down to what is now Calhoun Street. And this is a good way to look at the distinction between the early villas, this being the Joseph Manigault house at the top with the lodge, how large that lot was, and contrast that to the later infill where these lots have all been subdivided in very small, relatively smaller single houses constructed in a more traditional fashion to what we expect in Charleston. Basically there are 2 Wraggboroughs, the Villa Wraggborough and then the later Wraggborough that's very densely subdivided. And this is just a closer view of the Joseph Manigault house and its lodge, and Rag Square below it. This is Joseph Manigault house designed by Joseph's brother Gabriel. Sort of a classic villa type building. The piazza is on the south side. If you go around the north side of this house, there's no piazza. That's the same principle that we saw at 33 and 43 Charlotte Street. Very large landscaped garden with this wonderful lodge. This is a photograph from 1937. Looks much, much nicer today. The Second Presbyterian Church was finished in 1811. Its original name was the Second Presbyterian Church of Charleston and its suburbs. So when it was founded, it was recognized that it was serving not only the city of Charleston, but north of Boundary Street in the quote-unquote suburbs of Mazyck-Wraggborough and Wraggborough. This is a great federal period building. It is not on tour, but it will be obvious to people walking around. The steeple was actually never completed. This is the tower base of the steeple. The steeple was never completed on top of that. But it is considered to be one of the highest points of land in this part of the city, and the tower, even without its steeple, is very visible from many different parts of town. let's look at a couple of houses, and we're going to talk first about 10 Judith Street. Anyone here doing 10 Judith Street? We gave 10 Judith Street a Carolopoulos Award a couple of years ago for its restoration of the house and outbuilding. Judith Street is an L-shaped street. Originally, in the plan of Wraggborough, Judith Street stopped here, and this was a continuation of Alexander Street, but the marsh sort of interrupted the street. So in about 1830, they renamed the entire L-shaped street Judith Street. They dropped the Alexander part. But we're going to be looking at houses on the north side of Judith Street. So if you're looking at this map, this is the Aiken-Rhett house here, and this is 10 Judith Street next door. And this house is important. It's connected to a man named John Robinson. Robinson was a merchant and a developer. He was one of the founders of the Second Presbyterian Church and is buried there in the yard. He built numbers 6 and 8 Judith. He built number 10 Judith. And he built numbers 13, 15, and 17 Judith. And also built the Aiken-Rhett house, which was radically changed after his ownership. But for 53 years, he worked as a merchant in the city. And so the houses that he was responsible for make a little bit more sense when you look. I'm sorry, I told my Judith and Alexander Street backwards. Originally Judith Street was an L-shaped street, and we changed it for Alexander. So, anyway. Aiken-Rhett house at the corner of Judith and Elizabeth Street, 10 Judith Street, the house that's on tour. You see its outbuilding. He built numbers 6 and 8 Judith Street. And he also built 13, 15, and 17 Judith Street. So he basically controlled and developed that whole western part of Judith Street. This is number 10. It's a brick house on a high foundation, 2-story piazza facing to the south. Has a wonderful 3rd-story gable with dormer windows. This is an earlier photograph of it. It's been well maintained. It's had some restoration episodes, but for the most part, its character has not been too terribly marred. This is an interior photograph of one of the rooms. The house was built about 1814, and it has federal period detail. So contrasted with Joseph Aiken House, with its very big, large, sort of heavy mantles and things, very delicate detail on the mantles in the 10 Judith Street, the John Robinson house. He built what's known as the Aiken-Rhett house next door. This is a photograph from 1937, and sort of illustrating the history of the neighborhood. You notice the sort of late Victorian, early 20th century house squeezed between this house and the John Robinson house next door. This sort of reflects the subdivision of this neighborhood in later years. Moving down to Chapel Street. 2 houses that are on tour, 36 and 34. 36 here and 34 here. Notice the curves on the piazza. That's part of its architectural interest. We'll talk about in a second. 36 Charlotte Street was built by Anthony Vandross Toomer about 1810. A federal period villa. He builds 34 Chapel Street in the 1830s, and this house becomes the home of his son, Dr. Henry Vandross Toomer. Henry was a doctor who died in 1858, year of a yellow fever epidemic. At a young age, they said he overexerted himself, tending to the poor and the sick. He was buried at Magnolia, and his his tombstone says that the monument was erected by his friends and patients. Interestingly, not his family. Anyway, his patients loved him and of course missed him. But what's interesting about 34 is these curved, really unprecedented in Charleston, these curved rooms on the first floor, these bays that project out, also known as a Bombay room, B-O-M-B-E, not Bombay as in India. And the piazzas also reflect the curved nature of the facade. As you go into the house, up the staircase, there are a number of Gothic details. And so you have in this house a combination of Greek Revival and Gothic Revival architecture. that some have speculated, without any documentation at all, is connected to Robert Mills. Now, Robert Mills was a Charleston native. He was America's first native-born architect. He did do work in Charleston. He did design buildings that had combinations of Greek and Gothic architecture, and the unprecedented architectural character of this house suggests to some that Robert Mills is the architect, but we don't know that for sure. But it is a good opportunity to talk about Robert Mills and his influence in Charleston. He designed the fireproof building, he designed First Baptist Church, he designed the Marine Hospital on Franklin Street, before moving on to design other things such as the Washington Monument, which more people may know about, particularly people visiting us. But two important houses, both associated with Dr. Anthony Toomer, and I think between these two houses, people will see a difference, an important difference between federal period villa-style architecture, which looks more typically like a plantation house that you might find in the Low Country, and the sort of later Greek and Gothic influenced villa. And now just a real quick sort of discussion. There's a very nice write-up about the kitchen house at 42 Charlotte Street that's on tour. This photograph is the kitchen house at 10 Judith Street, which visitors will see. It's been restored in the last couple of years. This is a masonry kitchen house. Obviously, if you're burning a lot of food in a kitchen, you want it to be built out of masonry. So this reflects sort of the wealth and the sense of permanence we're here. So if you look at Charlotte Street, the kitchen house that we're looking at is right here behind number 42. And what's nice about the discussion is that the write-up pulls from some recent research that talks about the importance of the landscape of domestic slavery in the back lot of a house. How from the street you only see a certain type of architecture. You see the sort of the main house, and then the sort of the messy work part of the house is in the back, and where your slaves are going to be behind these high brick walls, and the owners, the masters of the domestic universe, positioned the lot so that there was a lot of open space, and they could look out the windows of their house and essentially see everything that's going on. People coming in and out of the kitchen buildings and carriage houses and things. So when you look at the Sandmore maps of early antebellum properties, they all follow a very typical pattern, particularly with these villas, where you would be able to look out of the house and have a good view of everything that's going on in your back lot. And the best example of that really is the Aiken-Rhett house, where when you look out of the back of the house, you see both the carriage house and the kitchen house, and you really would not miss anything that was going on. We're also happy to have Citadel Square Baptist Church open on the tour. They have been undertaking, and we were discussing a moment ago, a pretty extensive restoration project related to their roof, which has been riddled with termites. It's a $1 million project that they have taken on after many years of fundraising. The steeple has come and gone several times. This is the third steeple. The original steeple blew off in a storm. It was replaced. That blew off in a storm. It was replaced again. This being the historically accurate steeple that was put on about 20 years ago. And that's discussed in the write-up. This is a great example of Romanesque architecture in Charleston. It's typical of church architecture of the 1850s. It's similar to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church across Marion Square. Sort of Gothic elements to it, some pointed windows, the stucco covering over the brick to look as though it were constructed of stone, like a medieval church might have been, and then the sort of false detail of the buttressing that comes out supporting the church, reminiscent again of more medieval buildings. And so it's important, I think, for people to see that very large and thriving churches were part of this neighborhood in the 1850s when this church was built. And unfortunately, that congregation has dwindled to almost nothing today. But again, a good contrast to the villa houses that people will see on Charlotte Chapel and Judith Street. So That's a quick spin through the tour, yes.
You said they were false buttresses?
Yeah, well, these don't.
I can see the buttresses, so
Yeah.
they're
Well,
not
they're
really.
great, but they're not holding the building up.
Right.
This is a detail that they've added,
Okay.
sort of as a superfluous thing, to make it look like a more robust building. Any other questions? We're gonna go for a walk. We're gonna not walk past this church. You can drive by it at any point in time. But we're gonna walk and go look at the houses that are on tour and just see what draws our attention. And sometimes things come up, people have questions, we can follow up and get answers to them. And we'll provide you with as many old photographs as we can. We know that's really interesting to you and to visitors as well, to see how these properties have changed over the years. And we'll work to find some more of those. Sandy?
On the photograph front, we will have the photographs at the house, and so we'll print them, we'll have them at the house, they'll be in color, so you'll know that they will be there. We're in the process of putting all those together right now, rather than send copies to everyone.